Thank you.
Thank you.
Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANs processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Okay, Alex, we want to welcome you in again for a fresh teaching. And I don't know what you have lined up, but I'm sure it's in line with the foundation and so on. And again, I just would like to add to what Saeed said, that Mr. Kesh said, if we don't elevate the soul of the man and we give you the advanced technology, within a generation or 2 generations, you'll be right back to killing and eating each other. So it's all part of the elevation of the soul of the man. They're just not going to give the advanced technology. Alex, do you have that? Do you concur with that in a way?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you. And we welcome you, and we all share in your excitement and hopefully your understanding of the teaching, that your knowledge sharing as we do week in and week out. We thank you for being here and being part of this structure, being part of many other structures across this planet, in the Brazil, the Mexican, and other communities around the globe. So thank you for gracing us with your presence today. And please feel free. We see your screen, so you have taken over. I'm going to join on my iPad, and we'll carry on from here. Thank you, Alex.
And thank you very much. I'm going to echo what you just said. I'm very grateful to have this forum to be able to do this. And I want to welcome all the knowledge seekers to this session. It is part of the North American teachings, but we are represented by many different continents today, and now also because it's recorded to be done in the future as well. And that's what makes this meeting so powerful. And so we greatly appreciate your attendance here and assisting in that effort. Because as we say, it's fairly important. We're trying to bring the World Peace Treaty together, Kesh Foundation, and the teachings of Mr. Kesh. And I'm trying to streamline that. So this is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute, Teachings of Plasma Science. We are doing a review process of previous classes that we started 4 years ago. We are at the intermediate understanding stage. My name is Alexander. I'm from Canada. It is August the 6th, 2023. This is the Kesh Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So we are already in the 2nd year of the new space age, and we are all pioneers in this new space age. So it started last year on June the 6th, where we finally had some choices, and we could see the difference in the choice of our space that has always been non-visible to us. It's been a transparent space, and somehow it manifests in space. And it manifests in our Earth space, or outer space, but most importantly, our inner space. That's the key. And how do we get there? And what does it mean? What does it mean to us? What does life mean? And is that the only thing that matters? In other words, is our viewpoint the only viewpoint that matters? And so we find that we are carrying on from December the 16th, and which was kind of funny to say at that time, but it was the fulfillment of the prophecies. And so the significance of that, of course, is that the prophecies assumed that there would be status quo. So it's easy to predict the future if you extrapolate from the past and you assume that nothing's going to be done to change that. And if that is the case, then there's no purpose in life. There's no purpose in learning. And if the purpose of life is to learn, then the change is part of that process also. And so we have closed the book in many ways from December the 16th to July 30th on the various meetings with the Creator and trying to engage with the Creator. But now we come to, shall we say, the crunch time, where we have to see the interaction of the fields of the souls and the physicality. So this is a dual point of view here, because the way I've been brought up, it's been exclusively from the physical point of view. And when we look at our Earth space, we see that also from the physical point of view of the Earth space. And we try desperately to look at it from the point of view of the souls. Which souls? And so we have our souls. The Earth has a soul. The Sun has a soul. And the solar system has a soul. And so we always assume that we know which soul we're talking about. And so when we talk about that one soul, that becomes the focal point. But can you actually focus on that single point when in reality we have to take other things into account? And we call them relationships. So now what we're looking at is at the fields of the souls, plural, and physicality, singular. Fasten your seatbelts, it's an exciting trip. And so we have been pursuing the one nation, one planet, one race for world peace, because it's essential. We've tried 285 classes hosted by Rick Crammond every Tuesday. And the way we're trying to bring the world peace is by elevating the souls of the warmongers. And this is everywhere. And we try and do it in a superconducting way. And what's very interesting, of course, is that the internet right now is hot with respect to the subject of superconductors, something that we've talked about for almost 20 years. So, welcome to the outer space race. This was described in book number 1 by Mr. Cash, The Universal Order of Creation of Matters. So there has to be a universal order. There has to be a creation, and there has to be matter. And where is that matter? So in book number 2, we had the structure of light, which shows that There's matter there, and there's matter here, and there's matter somewhere else. And somehow, some way, there has to be a connection, a communication, and a transference. And then we see book number 3, the origin of the universe. And it's ironic that this is number 3 and not number 1, because the origin is the origination. But what it is the origin of the next phase. And so we see that 1 becomes more than 1. And so we multiply through division. And we create a relationship. And this is very significant. And the reason it's book number 3 really is because this concept is very advanced. And so we'll touch on that subject a little bit today. And as we go through this intermediate understanding, we understand that this is the next phase after the teaching sessions. We went through basic, intermediate, advanced teaching, and now we've advanced to the intermediate understanding level. So we're going to talk about divergence, convergence, conversion, inertia, dimension, transfer states, and GANs of oxygen. And let's see how that fits in with what's going on today. Because we're racing down this plasma highway in search for outer space, which is essentially the embodiment of our little piece of pie in the sky. It's a little tiny piece, but the plasma highway has no speed limit. So the only thing that limits us is actually us. And so when we look at how the universe was created, and we see that it multiplies through division, and so we have our universe and we have a sister universe, and there's a relationship there. Now there's something missing in this picture, because there's no accounting to go from the left side where we have the 1 to go to the right side that we have the 2. All we're looking at is the product, but there's no rhyme or reason as to why this is so. So when we look at rate creation, we get the answer, because this is the Keshe model nuclear decay of the neutron. And we see the neutron as 1 decay into an atom, which is a proton-electron combination or marriage. And the byproduct is the release of these PM ticks, which was not shown on the previous diagram. And so this represents a totality, and this now becomes an important focal point to understand, because a lot of our thinking is based on incorrect concepts or incorrect teachings. And we need to see how this develops without understanding how it develops. We have to look at the product. When someone asks us what is plasma, we have to tell them it's a kind of energy state. And there are different kinds of energy states. So they range from radiance to matter state. And it all depends on your point of view. And so our goal, of course, is to understand our Earth space. This will help us to find our inner space. And once we do that, then we can carry on with searching for outer space. And this becomes a very important purpose in our life, because that's what life is. And life is important. And so if important is not important, then nothing is important, right? That's why a lot of people, they have no respect for life. They trade life for money. And this is very important, because we all need to be self-serving. And we've adopted an attitude on this planet to be self-serving at the expense of others. But what happens there is that we weaken these others, and we get from the least. This is unfortunate. And instead of getting the energy flowing and be self-survey, which is important, but do this at the enhancement of others. Because when you're in the company of enhanced beings, and then you automatically become party to the party. And we all want to party. So there are plasma rules. And so we look at these energy states and how they change by at least an order of magnitude, that is 10 times. And then we look at the relationship between these energy states, and we see that the higher energy state feeds the lower energy state. And so these energy states change. That change is a manifestation. And it's either through natural creation, which goes to a higher energy state, or natural decay, which goes to a lower energy state. But there's an intermediate energy state, a catalytic or non-consuming energy transfer state, which maintains its integrity. And then in between all of these states, there are these transfer states. And they have an energy. And they have to have this energy to facilitate this transfer from state to state. And this transfer energy is higher in the higher plasma states, also by many orders of magnitude. So what happens as we go through these states? Well, we find that the importance of understanding the ethos of the universe actually increases, because the plasma is bound to the ethos of the universe. So the more aligned we are with the ethos of the universe, the more available the plasma energy is to us. So this is how the universe was created. It exists from energy. That's what it's all about. And so energy is always in motion, and energy is always positive. So we have to remember that. So how do you capture something that's always in motion? And if it's in motion, which way is it going? So we define energy as a charge. And it's a charge in motion. And if it's in motion, it has to have a relationship. So when we look at the book number 1 and we see the relationship, how we create one matter, but it's a combination of 3 matters, the matter of dark matter and antimatter. And then there has to be a relationship of another creation of matter. And is that matter on the same energy state? Does it have to be? So we can see that that combination can be between 2 energy states on the same energy state, or it can be 2 energy states on different levels. So we didn't know maybe that we had different energy states. But most of us are familiar with how to drive a car. And we have multiple speeds going forward, a speed going in reverse. We also have a neutral. So it shouldn't be that hard to understand how all of this is working together. What is hard to understand is, where does this energy come from? And for us, energy on this planet is something that is measured in money. Money is the currency of this planet. But energy is a transaction currency of the universe. And we see that a lot of energy comes from the sun. And the area between the sun and the earth is a vacuum. So how can this energy come from nothing? And this is where we encounter this vacuum theory failure, because the vacuum is full of principal matter. And so we find this principal matter is what affects the susceptibility of something, because something is always something as opposed to something else. And so that something else has to be the energy and the amount of energy that is being contained. And so we see, because that energy cannot be stopped, it has to keep in motion. It goes in a rotating field. And as it keeps going and rotating and rotating and rotating, you can see that it leaves a residue. And that residue manifests itself as a hole in the gas. So you can't see what made the hole, but you can see the hole. So try and imagine what made that hole. And so this is the energy that's in motion. And when we call this energy that's in motion, it manifests a plasma interaction, what we call the infinity loop, where all things are working in combination. And so if we follow the path along this infinity loop, we see that there's a magnetical and gravitational pushing and pulling, because it goes along one, and then suddenly it gets pulled back, and then it goes around and pushes forward, and then goes around and suddenly gets pulled back. That's not the only track, because there's a maglev at the core. And we don't see the connection, right? There's a gap between the connection of what's in the core and what's in the track of this infinity loop. So if we can't stop the energy, and if the energy keeps going around, what keeps the energy going around inside the core? And how is that different from what keeps the energy going around the track that goes around the core? And then how does the energy go from the core to the track that goes around the core? So obviously, how does it go from around the core on that track to going into the core? And that just this pairing. Well, what about the rest of the universe? So it's a legitimate question, isn't it? If the energy is flowing on this track, how is it connected to other fields that have a track? And if the energy is in the core, how is the energy connected from within this core to the energy in the field, in the core, inside another infinity loop? And how do you decide which one it is? How do you determine the susceptibility? So fortunately for us, the Earth has already figured these things out. So we see that the Earth gets this energy that comes from the sun. And so we've already seen that it passes through that vacuum from the sun. But every once in a while, after a rainstorm, we might see a rainbow. And what's interesting about the rainbow is the selection of the colors and the sequence of the colors. And what's different about these colors, of course, is that these colors in combination are white. But when we start to take into account the wavelength and the frequency, we see that that whiteness spreads out into what we have here is 7 different colors. And the thing is that there's a relationship between the wavelength and the frequency, which is to say, as the wavelength decreases, the frequency increases. And so we know that if there's a higher frequency, that means higher energy. And when we look at the rainbow, we see that the color with the highest energy is on the inside, the gravitational side. And the color with the lowest frequency is on the magnetical side. So we find that the relationship between the red and the violet is from magnetical to gravitational. And then all the colors in between maintain this relationship. So the wavelength in the equation as signified by lambda, and frequency signified by the letter F. And when we multiply those together, we get the speed of light. And so we know that the speed of light is constant. So in order to maintain that balance in that equation, then the ratio between the wavelength and the frequency always has to come up to the same number. It has to be constant. So as the wavelength increases, the frequency decreases. And as the frequency decreases, so does the energy. So as the energy increases, the frequency increases. But there's still no accounting as to why. But what we do now know is we know the position. And so when we look at the energy and how these energies are working, as per the brilliant Brazilian mathematician Dino Craspadon, this is God is a set of mutually perpendicular lines of force oscillating upon themselves. So we have the X, Y, and Z axis, and they're all perpendicular, but they're in straight lines. Well, light seems to change its nature as it goes from the center and goes out. And we've seen by the previous graph that it also changes its color. So when we're looking at light, and if we were to take a flashlight, and what we want to understand is the inverse square law. And what that means is in the relationship of distance versus intensity, if you double the distance, you will have the intensity. So obviously, if you have the distance, you will double the intensity.
Okay, I think Alex has dropped out. Let me take the screen back. And good thing we have co-hosts. Let's just give Alex a minute.
Am I still there?
You dropped out. I took the screen back. You'll need
Yeah.
to take the screen back. Thank goodness for co-hosts.
Yeah, just yeah, give me 1 second. I've
Yeah,
got to
no,
reset.
take your time. We have all the existence in the universe.
I just got to reset. 1 moment.
No problem. I was thinking if you dropped out, we were going to go to that clip on the schizophrenics, the beautiful people. That Mr. Kesh often speaks about these. He said we're all schizophrenics, but he refers to them as the beautiful people, or he says, are they normal and we're the schizophrenics? And I know we do cage up a lot of these people and again, tablets and the rest of it, but he said once you get to know them, And many of these personalities interact, and they're quite highly intelligent. I know he often refers to the story about one who advised a number of American presidents. We can only guess who that might be. I don't know if I think he still lives in Connecticut, although he made a trip to China, but I'm not sure if that's who recently, who Mr. Kesh was mentioning in some of the past teachings. Go ahead, Alex, if you're ready. Are you still with us? Okay, what I'm going to do at this point, I am going to, here he is. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause. Right, we're just waiting for you to take the screen. Okay, yes, there you are. You were talking about doubling the distance or reducing and increasing the intensity. That's about where you were approximately.
Yeah, well, something happened to the signal. It reduced in intensity. In fact,
Okay.
it disappeared.
You were getting quite intense there, so they doubled the distance.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Okay,
Yep.
let's get back to the serious subject of the inverse square law. Double the distance, half the intensity, half the distance, double the intensity. I guess it just depends on which way you're going, but seeing as you're holding the flashlight, you know, you can see that the light, the farther away it goes from you, the less it's intense. So this becomes a very important point when you're trying to figure some things out. So let's see what we're trying to figure out. Trying to figure out how to change the screen. Okay, this is very important. Acceleration. Acceleration is very important because it changes the velocity or the speed. And so acceleration is a change in velocity over the change in time. And so there's a relationship between those two. And because acceleration is a vector quantity, so it includes both magnitude and direction. Okay, well, the direction, of course, is towards the Earth, towards the gravitational direction. But if the change in velocity is zero, then the acceleration is zero. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you look at speed, which is a relationship between time and distance, and as put forward in the theory of relativity, where energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So we just change that to the speed of light squared is equal to the relationship between energy and mass. And we know that the speed of light is constant. And so if the velocity is zero, then the energy has to be zero. And so they talk about 0-point energy. But if there's no energy, then there's no point. And this is another false understanding. So there's no accounting for the change in energy in this regard. And this becomes a very important point because force equals mass times acceleration. And so if we say if that acceleration is zero, then in this equation, the force is zero. Well, if the acceleration is zero and the force is zero, what happens to the mass? And we know that there's a difference in the mass because when we look at the periodic table of elements, they are sorted according to their mass. And there's no accounting for the change in the mass. So we've got a problem here. So the light is still there because the light has a mass. And so we see that there's a difference between what we call the soul light, the spirit light, the mind light, the emotion light, and the mass light, which has to do with the matters, whether it be a plasmatic matter or a physical matter. And so, of course, there's a Gans light, which is to say, every element emits a light. Every element is made from a light because every element has a mass. So it has a light mass. And that light mass converges into the universal creation of matter, which we started out at the beginning with the amalgamation of the matter, dark matter, and antimatter into one field force. So we still have the mass, we just don't have an accounting for the change in the mass. So going back to the speed of light, so if we see that the speed of light is constant, and we found previously that the speed of light being constant can be represented by the relationship between the wavelength and the frequency. And so we said if the speed of light is constant, then that relationship is constant. So in order to maintain that balance, if the wavelength increases, the frequency has to decrease, right? And so we just substituted the relationship of the wavelength times the frequency in that equation. And we say that relationship squared is equal to energy and its relationship to mass. So if the wavelength increases and the frequency decreases, and that relationship is constant, then the energy to mass relationship also is constant. There's no accounting for why any of these components would change in this equation. There's no accounting for it whatsoever. So what causes the change? Where does the energy come from? Where does the energy go? And what affects the susceptibility? So we have to see that if the light has mass, the soul has mass. And so when we're looking at the speed of the soul, it can't be zero. It has to be infinite. And because if it was zero, if the speed of light was zero, then there would be no color, there would be no light, and there would be no energy. And what's left? Just the mass. The mass is left. The mass of the light and the mass of the soul. And so now we get a little bit better understanding of what's going on in book number 2, the structure of light. So the problem with acceleration, it involves a direction. So if we take the flashlight and we point it down, and we find that if we double the distance, we have the intensity. That's not acceleration, that's deceleration. And we know that because the light diverges from the origin, which is the flashlight that you're holding. So therefore, the intensity relationship to the distance is the same. but we flip the flashlight instead of pointing it down, it does not have any reference to acceleration. It has a reference to divergence. So the intensity is not direction. Where are we going with this? Well, the thing is, we're on Earth. And if we are looking at Earth as our gravitational point, then when we're looking at the sky, that is our magnetical point. And now we understand the divergence. The divergence is magnetical. So this divergence is the same thing as when you take two tangent lines and you put them side by side, they're not going to be at the same spot. So they're not going to be in the same relationship to each other. They will be perpendicular to the tangent line of the curvature of the Earth. So there's another factor here. One is the curvature of the Earth. The other, of course, is the rotation of the Earth. And so we can shine the light into the sky and it'll go. And it'll go as if it were without gravity. What keeps us on this planet? If we have an essence and we are the ones holding that flashlight, then we are gravitational. And so the light coming from us is magnetical. It is that emission that interacts with the Earth that allows us to be firmly planted on terra firma. Because that magnetical force is interacting with the gravitational force of the Earth. Opposite poles attract. So we're saying that the divergence is magnetical. But when we look at a maggrav, do we know which way it's up? So there's up and down, there's left and right. And since these are all diamond structures, there's another diagonal interaction. And is that energy coming or is it going? You don't know. There's no accounting for that. So if we are gravitational within our core, so that we are walking on the surface of the Earth, what happens when you go to sleep at night? We go into a dream and we leave our body behind. So what we know in the physicality is that it has the lowest energy. So if it has the lowest energy, then it has to be magnetical. The higher energy is gravitational. We know that because of the rainbow. The highest energy is on the inside of the rainbow. So if we are transcending into our dream state, and that is going in a magnetical direction, fortunately, it's going from a gravitational point and diverging into a magnetical point. And this is very important because we want to wake up in our body in the morning. And that's just the soul of the body. And then we have the soul of the man. And it too is transcending. And it is more gravitational. So there's a relationship between the soul of the man and the soul of the body. And there's a relationship between the soul of the body and the physical body. And there's a relationship between the body and the earth. And so the link is always the gravitational to the magnetical, the magnetical to the gravitational. So opposite poles attracting. And so what is going on here? And we find these flux lines that are going around the earth. So when we look at how we created the nano and we went into this monatomic structure, it was still physical, but now it was a nanocoding, which meant it was tinier. Even on an atomic microscopic scale or atomic scale, it was tiny. So it had a higher negative charge. So it had more energy to give. And that negative charge is magnetic. And then we went into the GANs, which is like a popcorn. So although it expanded, it had higher energy. But that higher energy was magnetical. It expanded, or shall we say, it was divergent from the core. So at the core was gravitational, and at the outer extreme, it was magnetical. And that's where we are. So the point of view becomes important. When we're looking from our point of view, we have to look at it from the soul's point of view. That's the gravitational point. And that has the highest energy. And that is at the core. And when we look at the least amount of energy, that's in the small matter state, which is physical, that becomes magnetical. And that becomes very important because that's how we walk on the surface of the earth. And so all the other ranges in between are of a different energy state. And then we find that in the GAN state, there's a connection. It transmits that energy through our emotion. So there's a relationship between the soul and the physical state. And that physical state includes our physicality and the physicality of the environment. Again, there's no accounting for the change because we haven't taken into account the soul of the environment. So when we look at this environment, we can clearly see that we can go through various energy states. And we can transcend these energy states to go higher and higher and higher. So with the lowest energy state, we see the small M matter state that has to do with heat and electricity. And then when we go to a higher energy state, that has to do with nuclear physics. And then we are involved in the higher energy state, that is plasma physics. But when we're dealing with nano and GANs, we're still in the physicality. So we have our 3 dimensions. But now we go through another transfer state, which is a dynamic plasma state. And we get into the plasma state of antimatter and the dynamic plasma state of the principal matter. And so now what we're looking at, not just a transfer state, but an interactive energy transfer state. So we now have an interaction of a plasma and the physicality. Now we're starting to get an interaction. And we have to understand that the range of activity is still in the same Earth space environment. We haven't changed our environment. So we are able to transcend all of these ranges from the physical to the plasmatic and still stay within the planet Earth. So when we start to accumulate all the spaceships that we've kind of known about, so we have the conventional physical flying saucers, we have the spheres, we have the cylinders. We have to assume that the light is another spaceship, because that light can bring the energy from the sun to the earth. And it does that plasmatically. And then on earth, it manifests into physicality. And then we can see that light. And we can see the different colors. And we see what the colors mean. And so this is the gift of life, that energy that is coming. And so in our case, we give and take this energy. And this energy is part of creation. And as such, it's also part of the co-creation, which leads to the procreation. That's just another word for the progression of creation. We like to call it growth. And how is that working? That is because what we emit is what we absorb. We have to emit before we can absorb, because otherwise we'll just puff up like the cartoon characters. And we'll be doing that at light speed. We didn't say which speed, though, did we? So let's carry on. Because when we look at the periodic table of elements, they're sorted by mass. And so that mass is an integral part of the speed of light equation, and it constitutes a manifestation of energy. And the fundamental energy that's important to us is the amalgamation of the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, which is the fundamental building block of amino acid, which we convert into protein. And then, of course, we have other energy states. We have an emotional energy state, which is represented by the zinc, and that has a higher mass. And then the physical state, which is represented by the copper. But isn't it interesting that the emotional state has more mass than the physical state? We have to understand that when we do the cups of life, because they weren't the cups of the pandemic. We created that physicality, and from that, we created the GANs. So we went from a lower energy state into a higher energy state. And one of those cups was the cup of emotion, and one was the cup of physicality. And we've seen that the energy focused in the center. And so when we're looking from the top down, we're looking from the point of divergence. We're on the divergence end. We're on the magnetical end looking down into the gravitational end. And we can see the manifestation of the field forces of the gravitational field forces, how they emit, and they emit this pattern. I can't draw this pattern, but the cup of life made this pattern. And it did it because of the rotating field. And so here's the Gans at the bottom of the cup. And you can clearly see it makes a ring. And in the center is this hole, which is the end product of the rotating field. And it's done a very good job. And so that's what's at the core. So you see right in the center, in the gravitational center, is the plasmatic field, surrounded by the Gans in a plasmatic state, looking through the water, which is exchanging energy with that Gans, which is exchanging energy with us as the viewer from our point of view, but we are on the divergent end of this point of view. We are looking down at the core. And so what we have to understand is that the energy that is coming from the core comes out in a spiral, but that's one way. Coming into the core, it follows an opposite path, spiraling in. So one spirals out, one spirals in. And this is not visible. All what we've seen was the hole in the Gans at the bottom. We didn't see the matter, dark matter and antimatter, and we didn't see the spirals. What we saw was the residue. And so that residue was the energy manifestation that came from the principal matter, which we call PM ticks. They come in energy packs, just like a parcel. They're just like you order it online, and there it comes, and it's coming all the time. And then there's an interaction, a force field interaction, creating this antimatter, dark matter, and matter. And when it achieves a balance, we call it a magnet. And then from that core, there's an emission. And that emission then becomes a plasma. And it's part of the feeding system. We haven't said what it's feeding, which direction. It's omnidirectional. And why is that? Because it's rotating. None of us are physically rotating. So what is this rotating? And this is the difference between when we look at the matter plasma. The small m matter plasma is physical. You can touch it and you can see it. But the matter plasma, capital M matter, you can't touch it and you can't see it. But you can sense it. And so the emotion is something that you can sense, and by the periodic table of elements, we see that the emotion is more dense than the physicality. So when two fields come together, they form another, and the formation of any field is a manifestation. It's this plasma feeding which leads to this manifestation, but this manifestation could be non-tangible or tangible, non-visible or visible. So there is a plasmatic reality and a physical reality. However, whatever that manifestation is a form artifact. And since we have an emotion, and it is more dense than the physicality, and we can see the physicality, but we can't see the emotion, so the emotion of presence is also a form artifact of energy in motion. That's the reality manifestation. It's there. We know it's there. And in every relationship, that's what constitutes a relationship, a balance of incentives. That creates a MAGRAV condition, a balance between magnetical and gravitational field forces. But it's a two-way street. So when we talk about the scientific community, we're only talking about the conservation of energy. And when we talk about the spiritual community, we're only talking about the spirit. So It's the plasma science which brings these two fields together and adds to that knowledge. And so that becomes a relationship, and a valuable relationship, because it leads to our understanding how this earth is operating. So we see that we have two rotating hemispheres plasmatically, but we have one earth that's rotating in one direction. And whether we're on the northern hemisphere or on the southern hemisphere, our magnetical emission interacts with the gravitational force fields of the earth. And so it doesn't matter which side of the earth we're on. It's always our feet are firmly planted on terra firma. So what's interesting then is the difference between the magnetical force fields and the magnetic force fields. So we all know what a magnet is, and we see that there is a force field when we bring two magnets together, and they will either repel each other or they'll be attracted to each other. And we facilitate one or the other by flipping a magnet. And so we find when the poles are alike, they repel, and when the poles are opposite, they attract. And we also find that when we remove these magnets, these fields go with it. That's in the physicality. But as we've seen in the cup of life, when we remove the magnetical force fields, the plasmatic fields remain. And as we've seen, they manifest themselves in something, either a hole in the gans or as a residue in an artistic form in the side of the glass. That energy remains. This is a feature of the higher energy states, and is the key difference between the plasmatic condition and the physical condition. So this is what facilitates the transmutations, not just what's going on inside. So inside we have our DNA and our RNA, and that is the plant. And then we have the phospholipids that go around the cell, which communicate via transmission. And then there's an energy that goes from inside the cell to outside of the cell, which is transition. And then the combination of those two creates this transmutation of a cell. And we have over 70 trillion cells in our body, and this is how they are manifested. Except no two cells are the same. No two cells are the same. That's amazing. So to create these cells is not a point of divergence. It's a point of convergence. That's the focal point. And so that's what we do with our history. You know, we want to have a focal point. And we want to concentrate on this physicality. We shine that flashlight so we can focus on that divergence. What? How can you focus on a divergence? A divergence takes you out of focus. That's what the problem is with the history. We have to understand that point of view. Is it a conversion or is it an inversion? Well, let's look at how plants grow. The sun comes up in the morning, and then that's in the red range. Then it comes at high noon. The intensity is high. That's in the blue range. And then it sets at night. That's in the red range. And then at night, well, there's no light, except it's still shining on the back of the earth. So we're still getting the energy. It's not limited by the physicality. And so regardless of wherever the sun is, the focal point is right to the soul of the plant. And what facilitates that, of course, is the rotation of the Earth. So wherever the sun in relationship to the Earth is, the focal point remains. Just like the plasma energy. And so we said that the flux lines stretch when you lift a rock because the flux lines are seeking density. But density has a direction, just like a acceleration. So when you let that rock go, it will accelerate towards the Earth, right? Because the Earth is gravitational. And it comes down like a slingshot. And it doesn't matter where on Earth you are. The acceleration is always towards the Earth. It always seeks density. So the focal point is always the same. Wherever you are, that's where you are, and that's your focal point. And you step with your left foot, that's your focal point. You step with your right foot, you move, but that's your new focal point. And then you step with your left foot, that's another focal point. And so you're able to move. And at the same time, the Earth is moving. And so wherever you are, you're in that gravitational focal point. And that gives you stability. So that density seeking is convergence. So when we look at the frequency of light on the rainbow, and we find that the selection, with the red being on the magnetical side and the blue or violet being on the gravitational side, then the light is seeking density. That's what causes the difference. Now we have an account. And we understand this because a lot of us hang on to string theory. And so when we play the guitar, we have a plasmatic finger which presses on that string. And we have another finger that plucks that string, and we create a sound. That sound has a wavelength and a frequency, but it is stepped down into the physicality. The fingers are plasmatic, the sound is physical. The physical is at a lower energy state. So now we understand how to play a guitar. Well, what about opinions? What about the vision? We have a vision. That's from our focal point. Well, what about the vision of others? It's their gravitational point, is their focal point, and their opinion becomes our diverging point. And there are many people with many opinions. And so that is a magnetical force field that goes out. Everyone is emitting something. Everyone is emitting literally what they are. So how do we interpret this? So when we look at the way we see things, things are kind of blurry. That focal point is blurry because you see the eye movement is digital. when we scan across the screen, we stop and start. We stop, move, stop, move, stop, move. And we look at the image. And so the in-between part, the analogous part, what we call them, is mental interpretation. It's the blur fill between these points. And that comes from us. We fill those blur points, right? Because that's not what we're seeing. So our blur points are the focal points. And we fill in what is being emitted to us. That's why the picture is so blurry. And so that's what we see in this plasma scan. We see the magnetical divergence from a gravitational focal point. And we see the different colors, which now tell us with respect to their field strength. But that is in the physicality. So what we have to look at when we see these colors is that they are a physical manifestation of a plasmatic reality. And since we understand that plasma is energy, is a representation of energy in motion, and then it has to have a relationship. So when we're looking at this plasma, we're only seeing half the picture. So when we look at a relationship, we have to look at two plasmas. We have to look at two field forces. And if we understand how two field forces, and especially if they're rotating in the same direction, when they come close together, there'll be kind of a friction. And so that'll create the sparks. And so all of these sparks will have a magnetical charge on them, and they will be of the same polarity. And so they will diverge. This magnetical divergence is the fingerprint of physicality. Small m, matter state friction, is part of the ray creation. Remember when the neutron split up into the electron-proton marriage of the atom? The plasma friction is convergence, and the convergence is gravitational. The transmutation from the physical friction to the plasmatic friction is the transmutation from the divergence to the convergence of energy. The polar flipping of the magnetical to the gravitational. This is done at light speed. This is part of our emission. We emit what we are, and we are gravitational. So what we emit is magnetical. And in order to have a magnetical, there has to be a gravitational core. And that is the essence of a PMT. And so we can do emission from the interaction of fields, or we can do an emission from the y-axis, a polar emission. And we're still doing this at light speed. So if we're looking at the plasma fields of the Earth, and we see that the Earth is rotating as one physical field, then clearly, if we had two fields of repulsion, two poles together, they would repel. So clearly, what causes the attraction is a polar flipping. And I hope no one suffered a tsunami or a headache And so you realize, regardless if you're in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, your feet are on the ground. And so these poles, these hemispheres are rotating in opposite directions, but they're attracted to each other, and they create one force field, which manifests itself as Earth, our home, which we happily walk on. So what caused this conversion? So there's another string theory, of course, that's the heartstring theory. If I have an idea and I give it to you, does that leave me with a hole in my head? Okay, because the idea came from my head. So I give it to you, now what's left? Or what about, if I give you a wish, or I display courage, or I give love, does that leave a hole in my heart? And so when we look at emotions and how it tugs at the heartstrings, say, hey, we won. Oh, we lost. Well, we danced. Oh, we cried. And then you find that really we leaked, right? We lost energy. We focused on what? Do we focus on the problem, or do we focus on the solution? We have to identify the problem. We have to focus on the solution. That's where we give and get the gravitational strength of that field. And so it comes together, and we're back at this infinity loop. And what's interesting about this infinity loop, that it has a give and take, right? There's a pushing and a pulling. Well, we're just going along the track here, right? And so we find that as we come to that point in between, we have a convergence. And then once we cross that center point, we have a divergence. But in order to come back, we have to have a field that is calling. And so we repeat the whole process. We have a divergence that comes to a convergence. And then again, it goes through a divergence and comes back around. And so we follow this track around the infinity loop. And so this center point, because it's an interaction of two fields, becomes this point of conversion. And if the poles are the same, then you see we have a repulsion. But which direction does it go? And so that point of repulsion, that field in between, is actually a field of attraction, isn't it? It also becomes an interaction point. And so now we have another axis. We have an x-axis, we have a y-axis. And so we see when we get into the star formation and how we have the interaction of these two fields, and if they have the same pole, then you can see that they repel each other. So there's a convergence, which goes into a divergence. In the center is this point of conversion. This conversion into what? Well, it depends on the susceptibility, doesn't it? And then we introduce another relationship, another conversion. And so now we have a reference. Now we have a relationship. And now we have another field, a sum of these fields, the sum of the interaction of these 2 points. These 2 points on the x-axis and these 2 points on the y-axis. And the sum of that field is the conversion field, which we call inertia. And so when we look at ourselves, we have to understand, yes, there's a transmission around the cell. There's a transition from within the cell to outside of the cell. But all of that leads to a conversion. And from that point of conversion, there has to be a relationship to another field that has a point of conversion, and it is between these two that we have this transmutation. And so now we better understand the Gans of man is this conversion of these fields. And we have over 70 trillion cells in our body, and each and every one of them has a conversion field. Now you understand why the Gans of man has more energy than the nuclear bombs. So this inertia is the convergence point between these two rotating hemispheres. In other words, that becomes the focal point. That becomes, so not only do we have the rotating hemispheres in the y-axis, but we have the infinity loop that keeps it together in the x-axis. And then there's a gap, this divergence gap. This is important. This is part of the nanostructure. You have the monatomic nanocoating, and then you have the nano gap in between the nanoparticles. They work together. One is the divergence, one is the convergence. And the combination of the two as they cross is the conversion. And then from there, it can manifest into a reality. So what is the difference between inertia and gravity? So inertia is the total interaction of the PM ticks of matter of a solid object without the central dynamic cores. Without these cores that create this magnetic and gravitational field forces. But through a new understanding, it is the PM ticks and gravitational fields due to the matter which is in the matter, the solid, liquid, gases, the matter components of the plasma. That's the difference right there. So the inertia is due to the total collection of the PM ticks of the constituent matter. So we didn't say how many PM ticks. We didn't say which mass, but it's the constituent matters of the atoms and molecules interacting and attracting with each other and any other matter or matters or other magravs. And it's applicable to these principles of inertia are applicable to dark matters, antimatters, as well as matter components of plasma in the universe. So the inertia of the plasma and the rules of the inertia of the plasma are universal. And so the difference between the gravity and the inertia is that the gravitational attraction is within the field. It's represented by the letter G. And the closer we get to the core, the higher the density. And the higher the density, the higher the field strength. But then the susceptibility based on path link is the inertia. And so this inertia is the bond between these two fields. That's the difference. So we see the fields, or we see the magnetic force fields of the magnets or we see the magnetical force fields of the cups of light, or we don't see the force fields, but they're there. We see the residue. And we don't see the infinity loop that connects it. And we don't see the conversion, which is the combination of the divergence and the convergence of energy fields that not only follow the loop, but emanate from the core itself. So we have an interaction between the core and the track of the infinity loop. We have an interaction that remains on the infinity loop. We have an interaction that remains in the core. And we have an interaction with other structures all around. And then the field strength of those structures all around affect the susceptibility. And so we are what we give our time and attention to. And so when we look at the cups of life and we see that there are different cups of life, and we can create, and each one is a manifestation, but as we see, you know, we have a soul, we have the soul of physicality, and then we have the physicality, and there's the three dimensions of the first three cups. And then we have the cup of earth is its fifth cup. Well, that's one field. And that field interacts with our three dimensions. And that becomes the inertia of the environment. So the substructure of the inertia of the environment involves our soul in relationship to the earth soul. So these are called the cycle of life cups. And so when we look at the stacker unit, we see, well, it's stacked in a vertical way. And so we have vertical life in the plants, and then we have a horizontal life in the animals. And we are able to do both. We're part of the horizontal life because that's how we sleep at night. But this is all part of the plasmatic matter state, capital M matter state. And what we have to realize is that the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. Which weaker strength does it feed? Well, because of the rotating field, it feeds all of them. So the cup of the soul feeds all of the cup of motion, cup of physicality, and the cup of inertia. Well, what about the cup of emotion? Well, it too feeds the cup of physicality and the cup of inertia. And what is the cup of inertia? Well, the cup of inertia is in between our cup of life and the cup of the earth. And so we now look at another dimension, transfer state, because we've identified two different dimensions. So on Earth, we have these different plasma states. But in between each of these states is an energy transfer state. But what we have to understand that just like each state changes by order of magnitude, the energy transfer states also change by order of magnitude. So the higher the state, the higher the energy transfer state. And so we find that we had nano-coated copper coil, which was in a higher energy state, and we had zinc plates and copper coils, which were in a lower energy state. And as a result, we created a magnetical field and a gravitational field. And so we understand that the gravitational field was the focal point. And when we interacted with the two cups, the emotional cup which had more mass, and the physical cup, which had less mass. But when the two worked together, at the core was the focal point of the cup of man. And so we find that the gravitational state has the highest energy, and that is the plasmatic state. And so all of these states are able to work within the range, but they all work in the Earth environment. And so the big difference, of course, is that there's a plasma state and there's a physical state. And so there's a dynamic plasma transformation that takes over. And that's the conversion from the plasma state to the physical state. And it's a two-way street. And so that is what we call inertia, the transformation between two field forces. Now in this diagram, it's a transformation between the plasma state and the physical state. But there's no rule that says it has to manifest into the physical state. We can have transformation of inertia between plasmatic states, and then that manifests as plasmatic reality. The option remains to manifest into its physical state. And so when we're looking at this dynamic transfer state, we can see that we can do this in the physicality, but it's a lot more dynamic in the plasma state, because we have a maggrav condition, and we have a divergence and a convergence of energy coming in. We don't know which direction. It can come in on the equator, it can come in through the poles, or it can come in through side channels. And wherever it comes in and wherever there's a field of interaction, that is the point of conversion. And the conversion remains to be seen based on the susceptibility, which is based on mass. Based on mass. And mass affects density. So when we're trying to figure out how to win this game of tic-tac-toe, we find that the defining conversion, we can go from the cup of life, which has 4 elements, shall we say, 4 fields, 4 gases, to the universal body enhancer, which has over 400. The conversion of those energies is at a higher order of magnitude in terms of its impact and its effectiveness. And so we see that, you know, when we're looking at our plasmatic manifestation, we find that the cup of soul, the cup of emotion, and the cup of physicality is part of our physicality, part of our being. But our being is dependent on the environment. So it's the environment of the earth and the elements that the earth has produced. And so our environment, our cup of soul, which includes those 3 cups and manifests its own magnetic or gravitational force field, and manifests the universal soul in those 3 cups, which now is taking into account the earth matter manifestation and the environment cup, the inertia cup. And so we see that now we are able to get into the plasma physics. And so when we talk about the transportation, we are talking about the physical manifestation within the range of the environment of Earth space. If we can go through a transformation within the Earth space, so that is to go from one point in the environment of the Earth space to another point of the environment of the Earth space, then all we have to do is substitute one of those Earth spaces for any other space. So we can have a transportation on Earth space, and we can have transmutation in outer space. Let's finish off with the gas of oxygen to tie all this together. So when we look at oxygen and its relationship to hydrogen, we find that hydrogen is basically an electron-proton combination, does not have a neutron. It has a mass of 1. Now, oxygen has a mass of 8. So you could say that oxygen is a combination of 8 hydrogens. So rather than calling it 8 hydrogens, we call it oxygen for the purpose of for convenience. But the oxygen, the way I was taught, had 16 electrons. I find out now that that is wrong, because we refer to oxygen sometimes as 16. Well, you see, I'm not a rocket scientist. So when I look at the periodic table of elements, I didn't understand that the mass number referred to the protons. So in effect, the hydrogen has 1 proton, oxygen has 8 protons. And since now we know that each proton has an electron, so this is why the oxygen is 8 hydrogens. But it has a mass of 16, but not exactly. There's a little fudging going on here, right? So that means 8 protons, it would have 8 neutrons, suggesting, of course, that there would be 16 electrons, because if each proton has an electron, then surely each neutron has an electron. But according to the Kesh model, what we see is that the neutron is at the core component, which is gravitational. And it's a combination of the antimatter, dark matter, and matter state, right? And then when we look at the decay model of the neutron, we find it is only then that it decays into electron-proton combination, which we call the atom. So the neutron, in fact, does not have an electron. What it does have is the release of a PM tick in the decay process. Well, we are not in that decay process. So when we're looking at the oxygen, we are assuming that there are 8 neutrons. So the mass is the combination 8 protons and 8 neutrons, which is why we say oxygen is oxygen 16. But if we want to convert oxygen to water, we have to add 2 hydrogens, which means now we add another 2 marriages of proton electrons. And they're in a specific position, which gives it the unique characteristic of water. And so water has this very unique characteristic in that it can give off an electron. it can give off a hydrogen. It just sheds it off. And so this is energy in motion. And so what's left behind is the hydroxyl. And the hydroxyl still is one oxygen and one hydrogen. And because it's missing a hydrogen, now it has a negative charge. And so as such, it is looking for a partner. And on this planet, we sometimes pick up dirty partners. And so we see that we can fulfill the goals of the water to be a universal solvent, but if it becomes dirty, then the positioning of the charge changes. So the conformity of the water changes. And so when you look at the energy structure of the dirty water versus the clean water, you can clearly see that there's a direction of difference in form, and there's an orientation of the direction of the charge. And the force fields are more powerful in the clean water. Now, if we get into the plasma water, we find that that is a force field that is stronger by an order of magnitude. And so what we find is that the purity of the water in the plasma state is enhanced by an order of magnitude. Unfortunately for us, the creation of water on this planet is done plasmatically. So this is why we always get clean water. And so that comes from the atmosphere. And when we look at the GANS sequencing, we see that the latest GANS, which is CH3, it doesn't have oxygen. And then when we look at water, it has both hydrogen and oxygen. And when we look at the other gases, they don't have hydrogen, they only have oxygen. So then we see that we can see that gas can be a gas. We can see that gas can be a liquid, as in water. And we can see that gas can be a solid, as in a GANS. So there is a gas state, liquid state, and a solid state. Well, interestingly enough, water has the same phases. And we always said that water has the same affinity as GANS. So water comes as a vapor, it comes as a liquid, and it comes as a solid in ice. But we find that water goes through different phases. So we know that frequency is a physical characteristic, which is why we can see the different colors of light. We can see that pressure is a physical attribute. Well, temperature also is a physical attribute. So let me say, frequency, pressure, and temperature are not part of the plasmatic characteristic. So when we're talking about temperature, we're talking about the phases of water in a physical state. And so when we look at the density, and we know that gravity, flux lines, and light seeks density, so the gas is less dense, the liquid is more dense. But the ice as a solid is less dense. It is this characteristic that allows for life. This is a unique characteristic, and it's part of the phase of water. That's what allows life to be life. So when we're looking at our soul vision, our focal point from our point of view, and what we see on this planet, which is a part of our environment, we go through this transformation, and what we see is this transportation. And for some of us, this focal point is disconnected from our visible reality. So our soul vision is going from the vision of the eyes of the soul of man in combination with the vision of the medulla of the soul of the body, and giving us an inertia field that is representative of our focal point and our convergence point with the soul of the earth, which is our environment. And so our soul vision is the transformation of these fields. And so when we do this movement on earth, when we're staying within the field of earth, that becomes a field of transportation. If we go into outer space, that becomes a field of transmutation. And so we can do both. So we can stay on the track, we can stay in the field, we can cross over from one field to another, we can cross over from one track to another, and we can cross over from one track to one field. This is part of the greater soul vision. And so the inertia becomes our choice of what we want to see, and comes from our focal point at our core, the gravitational force fields of our existence, and how it interacts with the gravitational force fields at the focal point of the existence of everything else. And now you see why harmony is so important. And so this becomes the dilemma for man. You know, we are mortal men. And so our burning question, you know, can a mortal man be an immoral man? Well, yes. We're all self-serving, and that's important to keep our immortality, but we do it at the expense of others, and we can be very devious. So, can an immoral man be an immortal man? Well, if you're drawing energy from the lowest energy source by stealing, raping, and pillaging, and abusing, then the more you get, the less you have. So this becomes more and more difficult. And can a moral man be an immortal man? So new plasma science says yes, but there are conditions. Can a mortal man be an immortal man? And the answer is yes, but there are conditions. So, can a mortal man be a moral man? It's not a question of can he. It's more of a question of should he or must he be? Because the only way to engage in the plasma science is through the plasma feeding rule. And so you have to have this catalytic stability to be able to either give for natural creation or give for natural decay, which either way is creation. And understand that it's a two-way street, and understand that is within the range on this environment or any other environment that we wish to choose from. And so the gravitational focal point comes from the plasma state, and it, if you will, decays down to the lowest energy transfer state, the small m matter state. And that's not a commentary, that's just a statement of fact. That's how things work. And so we find that within us, we have a heart, we have cells, organs, a brain, and we have fingers, and we end up with this physicality. And it follows rules. And these rules stem from the plasma feeding. And the feeding, it isn't food, it isn't water, it's energy. We didn't say what kind of energy. It comes from the source, and our soul is interacting with that source. And so by going through the universal enhancement units, where we can do a body enhancement by raising the field strength of the interaction of the soul and the environment. And then we have the material enhancement unit, which enhances the environment. The connection between the non-tangible and the tangible. And so we find that peace is a prerequisite. And so when we do our soul meditation, we have to open up to the energies of the universe and allow and yield to its presence so that we can receive it. But in order to receive it, we have to provide a pattern. We have to have some kind of gravitational attraction. And so when you provide the pattern, you get the energy. And so the quality of that pattern matters, because if you create a poor pattern, you will get less energy. So we have choices to make. And so when we're talking about the greater oneness, we're not foregoing our individuality. We have to understand that we're all part of the same community. We all come from the same creation. And just like all the cells in our body, all of the cells are part of the body, but they're all unique. They're all different. There are no two cells the same, and there's no two people the same. And so in order to understand how we can engage with the rest of the universe, we have to transcend the limitations of nuclear science. And we've been trying to do that for 497 Thursdays in a row at the Known Seekers workshops. So this is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute Teachings on Plasma Science. Call it all knowledge seekers. Engage your brain. Life's learning lessons transmute your soul growth. And world peace is the fundamental focal point. Make it a treaty. Sign it. Sign it with your heart. Sign it with your soul. Sign it with your pen. Understand that becomes the focal point. And as the dilution of emotion allows fields of life choices free from boundaries or abuse, and the ethos of the universe is what maps your position, and the universal community is your travel guide, because that's how they work. And it's the speed of love that manifests and determines your inner space emotional constructs. So the earthbound soul family has to go through this gravitational transformation to elevate the physical and emotional vitality and restore back to the emotion of knowledge, which is embodied in the transmutation connection, which connects equally to the universal cosmic rays. Freedom broadcast. Freedom broadcast of the universal cosmic rays of inner space. And the elemental conversion can only resonate with the proper plasma universe. Plasma science needs to continue to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And I hope you enjoyed this trip to them. Thank you so much for allowing me to present.
Well, you're still delivering. Thank you, Alex. We have a thumbs up, and I'm sure many thank yous in the background plasmatically. I can hear them. You've taken us on another journey around this plasmatic science, interactions, and so on. And I think it's added to the knowledge. So thank you very much for your continued presence and desire to enlighten us, elevate us, so that we can share more. As we always do, we usually open the floor up for a question or a comment or whatever you'd like to ask Alex. Saeed, again, in the chat, just after you started perhaps, has a question. Will Kesh plasma science and technology be shared with neighbors surrounding China? I am personally living in Pakistan. I would like to have this revolutionary technology and enlightenment in my country. Do you have a plan on how to tackle the monopoly and mafia of the world in order to expand this technology? Thanks. I know the foundation, Mr. Kesh, is well seasoned for this type of work with quite an extensive resume, if you would call it that, or background. And we know man is not the most difficult place he's been before. So I believe there is a plan in place. Again, this is just not back of the envelope calculation, but this has been laid out centuries in advance. But Alex, is there an overall plan?
Definitely there is an overall plan. And then one of the limitations, of course, is the rate of change. And so we have to look at the plasma science and see the rate of change going from field state to field state is an order of magnitude. And so that means 10 times. But how many orders of magnitude? So if we go 2 orders of magnitude, that's not 10, that's 10 times 10 is 100. And so how could we multiply our benefits this way? And so individually, it's extremely difficult to do. However, how we are doing it individually is through the peace stone. And the reason for that is because we are engaging the field strength of the earth. You see, the earth is what brought us here. You don't think so. You think it was the glint in daddy's eye. Well, the glint in daddy's eye said, hey, look, you know, earth is a good place. And we now want to bring a family here. And you agree. You can't remember because your soul made the decision. And the reason your soul made the decision is because your soul interacted with the souls of your parents and the soul of the environment. But there's another soul family that's on this earth, and that's the human family. And so the human family all made that same decision. So that decision was made by the souls. And that decision is true. The fact that we have disconnected from our souls and distanced ourselves from that decision did not remove the decision nor the determination to fulfill that decision. Your obligation on a soul level remains. And so we cannot play on the lowest energy levels. We have to elevate to a higher energy level. And so what we've been trying to do for the last 4 decades is to try and appeal to the physical higher powers. And one of the nice things about history is that history teaches us the lessons of how to do things. So if you make a mistake, that becomes a learning point. And if you repeat that mistake, well, then we learn that you're an idiot. So when we look at the repetition of our history with war after war after war, then, you know, we start to understand that we are not gaining the benefit from our history. We're not learning anything. So therefore, we're working in the wrong field. We're working in the soul of physicality, which is disconnected from our soul, which has patiently waited for us to fulfill the obligations to the promise that the soul made with the soul of the earth before we were born. And so by elevating our playing field to that of the plasma dome, which now engages the souls of the family of humanity, the souls of the earth, and in fact, the soul of the sun and the solar system. And let's not forget the souls of the universal community. We have now partnered with the rest of the universe. So instead of just sitting there engaging ourselves, we're a little tiny perfect corner and to be the big fish in the small pond, we now move to a bigger pond. And because of the situation in China, we have to understand that when we say China, each of us has a connotation of what China is. And in the question, there was a reference. So we understand that there are different personalities. Each country has these multiple personalities. And so some personalities operate on the lower field and other personalities operate on the higher field. And we have to operate on the higher field. And why is that? Because it brings in a new rule, the ethos of the universe. When the soldiers leave, after they have crushed all the flowers, after they trampled all the grass, and after they've infused all the physicality, when they leave, life comes back. Peace on earth is of a higher energy state. And so the flowers grow again. And, you know, in our physical reaction, we have been accustomed to, well, if your father, you kill my father, then I want to avenge his death and kill you. And then your son will come and kill me. And this is how we repeat our mistakes. Well, when the soldiers brutally crush the flowers don't gather up, come together, and then they squirt out this bio pollen or whatever to kill the soldiers. They don't do that. They grow back and they bring the beauty, they bring the peace, and they bring the harmony. Why? Because they're true to their soul. The soul is at the focal point of the core of their existence. And so they're true to themselves. And so what the soldiers do in physicality is unfortunate. But what the flowers want to show is that the flowers are stronger than the soldiers. So when you're looking at the physical state, that is the weakest state. And you know it's the weakest state Because one of the biggest problems for many soldiers is that they don't make enough money. The amount of money that they make does not wash away the tears for all their actions, does not allow them to sleep at night. When they look at the dollars in the bank account, you can add another 10 zeros to the end of that dollar, and it's not going to wash away the horror that they go through, what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, to where they come resigned to the fact that they were murderers for hire. And life, thou shalt not kill. And being paid for it, or doing it under the legalese of declaration of war, does not make it allowable. It's a supreme violation of the universal law. And so you pick the system, you have a choice. And we haven't had the choice because of the overwhelming pressure that we're getting from the various governments. So what you have to look at and you see what's happening in Pakistan, and you see that the leaders there and the result of what the leaders are doing, and you say to yourself, what if I'm the head of my family should benefit from me being the head of my family, and if my family is suffering from me being the head of my family, then I need to quit. I need to resign. I need to remove myself and let someone more competent take over. And that's what's happened in China. So the China today is not the China it was last year. And they have realized from their history that the current modus operandi is a failure. Peace on earth is what brings prosperity and harmony. And that's what life is all about. And so we get to choose the methods that we do this. And now, when we find that the plasma science is operating at an order of magnitude, but not one order of magnitude, but many orders of magnitude higher, then we find that when we are communicating on the soul level, we are doing things with honesty, with integrity, with an ethos that is missing in our physical diplomatic discourse, because that's operating on the lowest energy level. And so we abandon that field and we work from the top down. And direct answer to your question, how do we do this in Pakistan? We do it in China, because the Chinese community is suffering and they know it, and they need to do something about it. Okay? And if your neighbor has a nice shiny car and you are riding around on a donkey, you have eyes to see. You will see that shiny car and you will ask the head of your family, is why don't I have a shiny car? Because the head of your family is accountable. And that's all we have to do is demonstrate that. And then the accountability falls squarely in the lap of those who have assumed the responsibility. Responsibility without accountability does not work. Answer your question. Great question.
And of course, as Mr. Kesh said, there'll be a natural flow into the one belt, one road nations, or the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the original forming nations. So if you're in one of those nations, obviously you will have access to it. And plus all the other nations that have joined. I don't know if Pakistan is part of that. They probably
Well,
would like to be.
I didn't answer that part of the question, Mark.
Oh, go right ahead.
Well, there's a financial problem in Pakistan, right? So it has to do with debt. Every country has debt. And so the problem with the debt for Pakistan is that it's a Chinese debt. And so there's two ways to relieve that debt. And one is to roll it over. And the Chinese have done that. And the other is to borrow money from another source, which is the International Monetary Fund. Now, the Chinese debt charges interest. The International Monetary Fund imposes other conditions. So what has happened this week is that the need to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund has been removed because that debt now has been paid. It's been rolled over. So the perceived financial problem that Pakistan is facing has now been removed off the table. So how does that change the game plan? And if we're still going to the old game plan where we now need to hat in hand borrow money from the International Monetary Fund and basically sell the soul of the country for that purpose, then you have to start to question the motivations. And so this now becomes obvious because it's done in the open. It's public knowledge. It's going to change. It's going to change the thing. You have to look at the intentions and how things work. So the head of the household has to make proper decisions. And so the fact that the Chinese have extended a grace period to relieve the pressure, we'll see if that pressure translates into a benefit for the people. Let's hope so.
Thank you. And we're almost up to our noses in debt here in the US with approaching 30 trillion or more. But again, that can all be, it's phony debt. Again, much of it. It can be put into a Chapter 11 bankruptcy sort of reorganization.
No, the difference, of course, is that that debt is in US dollars and all the US has to do is print that money. So it's that you look at the South American countries, they are no longer assuming the debt in the US dollars, because if you're borrowing in US dollars, you have to pay in the US dollars. So they're now substituting that for Chinese currency or any other currency in fact. So even if you look at India, for instance, and they can pay in rupees as well. They can pay in rupees, they can pay in yuan, they can pay in the rubles. They can still pay in dollars, but you know, paying in dollars is what got them in trouble in the first place. So there's a reason for that, and that is you know, it's funny, you know, when you go to the bank and you borrow money, they don't want you to pay it off. If you take a mortgage out on your house, they don't want you to pay it off. Okay, we found that out. We had a lab, and our mortgage was $230,000, and we were behind on the mortgage by several $1,000s. And so they foreclosed on the mortgage. Well, now they have a property. That's what they wanted. We couldn't pay the money, so we couldn't get the rollover like Pakistan got from the Chinese. We couldn't get that. They wanted the property, so they took the property. Okay. Now they have the property, but they're not in the property business, they're in the money business, so they had to convert that property to money. So they turn around that $230,000 that they foreclosed. They sold that property for $200,000. So they in fact lost money on the sale, which was more money than what we owed. So you can see the malicious nature of the transaction. It wasn't a matter of the fact that we owed the money. It wasn't a matter of how much money. It was a matter that they could foreclose and put us out of business, and then they could flip that over. And you know, there are benefits to taking a loss, and they take that and then they roll it over into another mortgage for some other sucker. And that's what it is. It's a sucker business. And what, to my horror, I found out that when you take a mortgage from the bank, and so I don't know what it's like in the US, but in Canada here, you leave the bank, you go into your car and you pull out of the driveway, and before your wheels hit the road, that mortgage is sold in the international market for 10 times. So your $100,000 mortgage is sold for $1 million on the international market. What a racket.
Right, and of course, this technology will allow countries not to import so much oil, as you can tap into the universal energy. So it's going to bring a relief and a leveling, as Mr. Kesh said, to the nations. And when you can create materials, or internationally, tons of gold will be the same price as tons of copper, and so on. Or when you can feed the nation and not have to import food grains and so on. This will be a big relief. Again, slowly, not a radical thing, but I think it will be greatly sought after. And again, in exchange for peace. Pledging your nation to peace will relieve all of this condition. Great. Anyone else want to make a comment? We could read another question from Saeed. He has a lot of them, and that's fine. We all do. Would anyone like to open their mic?
Is there another question from Saeed?
There is.
Okay, read it.
Okay, again, I have heard the Tartarian civilization from Russia, which had advanced zero-point technology before Industrial Revolution and electricity. Yes, we even had flying carpets and other advanced technologies. We had Mr. Tesla too, didn't we? Who was driving a car, pulling energy from the universe in the 1890s, 1899. And again, that technology was sort of lost or suppressed or co-opted and so on. So yeah, many civilizations, I think, had aspects of advanced technology. But that is the question, Alex. There was zero-point technology before Industrial Revolution and electricity. But it didn't seem to go anywhere.
I'll have to correct you on a couple of things, Mark.
Yes.
Tesla's car was 1932, a Pierce Arrow with an 80 horsepower electric motor.
Okay.
For 2 years, he went around with his nephew to be able to get hold of somebody to invest and build these cars, and nobody dared get into the business. So he just destroyed the car.
And maybe Saeed's not aware that we did the same thing in 2011.
Yeah, we've done it so many times. I mean, the pharmaceutical business also, 1913.
Right. As Rick often says, if you make an electric motor that's 20 percent more efficient than what's on the market, it will not be allowed on the market.
Well, look at the new Mercedes-Benz motor.
Mhm.
It's it only weighs 20% of what the Tesla motor weighs, and just as powerful. It's a new design.
And that's why the countries or the lesser developed countries will have probably go with it quicker than the Western, because the debt or the technologies that were employed have to be sort of paid off. All those who invested in certain technologies, they don't want to let that go. They should, but they don't want to let that go until it's been fully paid off to the ones that invested in certain fiber optic cables or others. In the other countries that didn't invest in that, they're going to have a significant advantage because they'll be readily able to adapt the technology, because it'll be allowed. There's no paying off of whatever was put into it, into the infrastructure of a certain economies that has to be, it's been amortized, it needs to be paid off. So this is another aspect of looking on how lesser developed countries will actually become greater developed countries.
Well, we'll see, because here in Argentina, 100 years ago, we were the 7th richest country. Now we're, I think it's below 197th. We owe so much money because the politicians have pocketed so much, a whole year production of the whole country. It's incredible. What for? I don't know.
It's the greed of the man. I think
Yeah.
that's what it is. Yeah. And as long as we have a money system and as long as we have greed, that will still be here for a while. So we'll probably still be on some sort of, but this technology is definitely going to take a lot of the pressure off in many different areas.
Yeah, we've got to change our values. What's the value of a monetary value compared to your soul value?
Yeah, take
Your
$1 billion
integrity.
to Mars and see what it gets you.
Yeah. The next 10 years we'll have so many changes coming in.
Yes, yeah, I think it's going to be delivered in a massive way. And as
It's
Mr. Kesh said,
worthwhile living this change.
the more we use the technology, the more it'll become widely accepted. So there's a process that's still we're going through, but people are going to be getting earfuls of it, and they'll be hearing about it and be inquisitive of it. I don't know how much of it'll be blocked, but we know in China and the BRICS nations, it will naturally, this will be a natural flow through. And when the countries that don't have it see it, they're going to want it, especially going out into space. How many billions and billions and billions of dollars has the United States spent? And we haven't been back to the moon since the 1960s.
Have they been there? That's a big question.
Well, that's another question. Sure, I think we'll find out more about that in the coming time. In a very short time.
In 2016, at the Geneva Auto Show, Cadillac showed their future concept thorium-powered car. Shown one time for 2 days. We never heard anything about it since.
Again, wasn't that shown in the 1950s as well?
The Ford did that in 1957 with a nuclear powered car. In 57. And how many trucks did Mr. Kesh have in England running with anti-gravity technology? And I heard that there were pictures of his trucks going down the M5 or something with the front wheels barely touching the ground and an extra 1,000 pounds payload.
Yes, it's just a few trying to control the many.
Exactly.
This is the freedom that this technology is going to bring to everyone. And as he said, once we start learning the transmutation, if your country, your map location is not offering what you'd like to have, perhaps you may change your map location instantaneously and go where there is more freedom and more technology available, where the pain and the suffering of living in this physicality is greatly reduced. Perhaps these space cities, I know that there's tests going on, I'm sure, in China right now with the feeding and with the energy and the elevation of the soul through the gases. So we'll see a lot. It's coming. It's here. It's just going to be revealed. But as Mr. Kesh said, the agreements are that the nations will bring it forward themselves when they're convinced or when they're ready and when they've confirmed the technology. As he said, the Chinese want to have everything perfect, confirmed backwards, forwards, and upside down. So they're doing, I'm sure they're running a lot of tests. So things are going on, big time things in the background. And as was indicated, NASA is going to have an opportunity to test this material, British Nuclear, Washington, D.C. It's just the question I'm sure the world leaders wanted, but they want it for themselves and not so much for the nationals of their country. So this is where the part of the big glitch is as well. Okay, any other thoughts or questions or comments anyone would like to make or share?
Hello, Mark.
Yes, Jefferson. Hello, welcome.
Hi, Jefferson.
Hello. Hello, Mark. Hello, Alex. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I would like to, during your explanation, Alex, when we were talking about the periodic table, about the gas of oxygen, and normally I have a really doubt about the difference between, for instance, the nitrogen that's an odd number, it's number 7, oxygen's 8, and the carbon 6. That's the difference between this extra proton. What is it, the difference that generates more energy that can tights? Because we see the zinc is 30 and we have a 15 a twin star, let's say, and we have the zinc 29, so we have a 14 twin star, but we have one left. What's this difference of the energy emitting or receiving between the even number of protons or the odd number of protons? That's thing that sometimes I know there is a lot of difference between energy emission or receiving, but I don't know exactly how it works. If you can clarify. Yes, just like this. Just the atomic numbers. Thank you.
So it's a very important point. 7 is asymmetric and 6 and 8 are symmetric. So that's odd and even. And so the nitrogen is giving to the carbon, but nitrogen is taking from the oxygen. But then when you look at so nitrogen -1 becomes carbon, nitrogen +1 becomes oxygen. But since the higher energy feeds the lower energy, what you have to look at is what happens when the oxygen loses 1, right? And so it becomes nitrogen, but it gives off 1 hydrogen. But oxygen comes in pairs, nitrogen comes in pairs. So the oxygen then has to to maintain its field, it has to draw something else in. And so you see that oxygen combines with everything. So when you look at all the ganses have oxygen. But we haven't really fully looked at, do all the elements in their GANS form, do they all combine with hydrogen only? So oxygen is a key component of that. So oxygen is the gravitational component. But the hydrogen is the energy transfer part. So if nitrogen gives off another one, it becomes carbon. Well, now we have a second hydrogen. So what does that mean? So you know, if we keep giving off, you know, nitrogen is 79% of the atmosphere. So the nitrogen is constantly giving off hydrogens. And so if we get, you know, 14 of them, then we have silicon, right? If we have 30 of them, then we get zinc. So this is the whole process. So the nitrogen is constantly giving and taking, giving and taking, giving and taking, but it's giving and taking within the Earth's environment. That's not where we are producing the energy from. It's coming from the sun. It's the manufacture of the nitrogen in the Earth's environment is an inertia field. And on the plasmatic level, it as an inertia field, it can give and take this energy. It's when it becomes into the physical state, then it becomes an element. So when you look at the nitrogen, it's always coming as a pair. And then you see it combines with, well, nitrogen can combine with 4 hydrogens, 3 hydrogens. It can combine with 1 oxygen, 2 oxygen. It can combine with 3 oxygen. It can combine with hydrogen and oxygen. And then if you throw in carbon, now the nitrogen is facilitating the amino acid structure. So we are always looking for that little elusive thing, and we're missing the big picture. You know, we're looking like for that 0.04% of carbon, and we're missing the 79% of nitrogen. That nitrogen is vital for life on this planet. So it is from the nitrogen, look at it, it splits up into oxygen and carbon. And the byproduct is hydrogen. And the hydrogen is the energy in its physical state, it's hydrogen. In a plasmatic state, it's a PMT. How we doing, Jefferson?
Wow, wonderful. Understood. That's because of the strength and the importance of the nitrogen in the structure of this atmosphere that we breathe. The oxygen has got this 20% only in our body. I was just watching a teaching of Mr. Cash that the nitrogen, that is the conversion of the oxygen, this oxygen within our lungs that produce the strength for blood and whatsoever. So I was just wondering how powerful this nitrogen, or that comes, I believe it forms the amino acids here from the sun in the outer space. And as well, in our planet, I believe it's formed the nitrogen that can create another in this. But I was just thinking about this relation between the even and odd, between the elements.
Huge. It's huge.
Yes,
it's a huge relationship. So, you know, if you look at below oxygen is sulfur, 16, and then selenium, which is 34. So it's basically a multiple of the oxygen. Then the same thing with the carbon, you've got silicon 6 to 14 to germanium is 32. Those are all even. But then you go to the column next to it, they're odd. Now, Look at copper. Copper is odd, but copper is physical. The zinc is even, so it's more stable. You see what I'm saying? So what is that? So
Yeah.
it's the emotion that is the stability of the human element. So the physicality is you know, exchanging the energy. That's why we're depleting on energy all the time. So the zinc is the stable part. The carbon is the stable part. Oxygen is the stable part. But now, if you go to the far right, you look at the inert gases, and you see that neon, argon, and krypton, they're all even. And then you've got this freak. You've got this freak, helium. But what is the difference between helium and hydrogen? So they're both one. They both have a mass of 1. Right?
Yes, the atomic number.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, one have more protons, I think, more neutrons. Huh? The neutron, because the helium is stable, in my view, because it's
Yeah,
used
but
to stabilize the system.
But again, as a gas, it comes in pairs.
Yes.
See, so the helium is a variation of the hydrogen. This is what I'm saying, because they're both one. So you have both with the same mass, but you have a different name. So, you know, how is that possible? So the scientists aren't asking that question. This question that you ask is an important question. So, you know, when you look at hydrogen, hydrogen is the only one on this periodic table of elements that doesn't have a neutron. So,
it's another dimension, maybe, no?
Well, because the plasmatic state is in a higher energy state. Okay, so that energy is of a higher energy. So, you know, if you know, if you want to try and make an equation, you know, between the two, and so you have one in plasma state and you have one in physical state. Well, that's not fair. You need 10 in the physical state to make it balance. Okay, so this is the question. The question I ask is, if I'm looking at the oxygen, and the oxygen has a mass of 8, and I add 2 stinking hydrogens to it, and I have a Maggrav condition, how the hell is that possible?
Yes, I understand.
So it's not a mass of 1. It is a mass of 1, but it's not in the physical state, it's in the plasmatic state.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, thank you, Alex.
Well, this is an important point. So today's whole class really is to understand the difference between the physicality and the plasma reality. How can you tell? So right away, this is how you can tell. So when you're looking at these elements, they're in the lowest energy state, so you know it's physical. So then as soon as you see a combination, then it's a molecular. But we can have a molecule in the physical state. But now we have gases that are also molecules, but they're in the physical state, but they have a higher energy level. So we can have a higher order of magnitude energy in a physical state. So, you know, it's you know, if a child kicks you, you know, it might hurt, but if a man kicks you, you may end up in the hospital, you know. So that's the difference in field strength, right?
Okay.
I mean, you've got to relay it something that you can understand. But now you take that same relationship and you go into a plasma field. Okay, so then you say, okay, I'm not just looking at the gas. I'm looking at the energy that comes from the gas. Now, I take another gas and I take the energy from that gas. So what does that mean? That means that the energy that is emitted from that gas is of a higher order of magnitude. Now, if I interact those two fields, now I get an inertia field that is at a much higher order of magnitude than the interaction of the gases, you see. So we have transformed from the physical state to the plasmatic state, but the rules are the same. You get two fields, they interact. So quite literally, you know, if I have to dig a ditch and I have one shovel, I can dig, you know, say a 1 foot trench, you know, in 1 minute. Okay. But if I have a backhoe, I can dig 1 foot trench and I can dig in the same amount of time. Maybe I can dig, you know, 10-foot trench, right? An order of magnitude. So it only stands to reason, and that's in the physical state. Now you move me into the plasmatic state, maybe I can do 10 feet, okay, just like the backhoe. But then take the backhoe and move it into a plasmatic state, well, it's going to do 100 feet. Well, wait a second. The difference in the physical, I do 1 foot, the backhoe does 10, that difference is 9. But if I go into the plasmatic state, I do 10, the backhoe does 100, the difference is 90. You get it? This is why we have to move from the lower energy field. This is why electricity and electricity is obsolete, right? We are getting energy from the electron. We need to drive the energy from the focal point to the gravitational focal point from the proton. That's the big difference with the plasma state. And then how you do that is you take the entire, so oxygen in the physical state is not the same field strength as oxygen in a plasmatic state. One more example. The water that you drink that comes out of the tap is in the physical state. That water does not pass through your intestines and goes inside. The energy, the field strength from that water passes through. Okay, but it's of a weak state. So what happens inside? How does it become plasma water? All right, so what you're using is the energy of the oxygen and the plasmatic energy of the amino acid. And so that amino acid takes the energy of the water and creates water. What happens when you create water? You create protein at the same time. That's why the amino acids are the building blocks of life. So the star formation of the amino acid is at the focal point, the gravitational focal point, and from there it's building. And so every time you produce one thing, you produce another thing. It's not like in a factory where you produce something and the rest is garbage. There is no garbage in the universe. So if you have nitrogen, you're producing carbon, same time you're producing hydrogen or oxygen. Thanks, Jefferson.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you, Alex. Really nice. I was just looking at the light magnetism instead of electromagnetism. I think it's the point to go to the light, I think. Thank you very much, Alex, for everything. Thank you, Mark, as well. Thank you, everybody. Standing by.
Okay, I think we've reached midnight in Europe. Would anyone else like to add anything? What elements yes, go right ahead.
I watched a video yesterday of some people in the automotive industry who have successfully taken an internal combustion engine from a junkyard, put it in a vehicle, made it run on pure hydrogen gas with very little modification. The one gentleman said, the beauty about hydrogen is if we have a leak in any of the lines, the molecule of hydrogen immediately goes and travels up. It doesn't stay on the earth. And he said, I don't know why, but in the lab, we had to prove that in order to get certification for our tanks and our lines at over 7,000 PSI.
Yeah, that's a beautiful video. I saw it also. That truck
Yes,
with that tank,
yes.
that black tank.
Yeah,
In the back part. Yeah, it's beautiful.
those are some very knowledgeable people in the industry in that video, especially that lake speed.
Yeah. And it just also has the typical V8 noise rumble.
Yes, it does. It
Not
sounds
just
just
like noiseless electric car.
exactly. So it'd be interesting to, I wonder.
Well, we'll have a lot of news.
Well, the
next,
thing
I
is,
think.
why not take, I always, after I seen that, I thought, why can't we make and try to use plasma water and try to make that into steam?
Well, there are two different systems. You decompose the water into hydrogen and oxygen. And there's another, the Joe cell, which they've tried to cover up. That was made in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Joe had to disappear because they wanted to get rid of it.
It had to go quiet, yeah. Just like
Yep.
anything that helps, that, you know, takes away from the profit margin, it won't be allowed. But that's about to change. That's all changing.
Any other comments? I'm going to play Tom Salas's dome that was created. I think it was sort of accidentally, but Mr. Kesh said when we have certain conditions of earthquakes like in Turkey and so on, and aid, it may be in the middle of the winter, very cold conditions, we can create these domes permanently. Well, permanently maybe 3 years to 5 year length, but you have to know what you're doing. And they can create a dome very similar. If you look in the background of the video I'm going to play, this was in 2017, I think it was submitted. And this was in relation to Hurricane Maria, where if you look in the mountains in the background, you won't see a green leaf on any of the trees anywhere he focused. It was all sort of brownish or dark. There was no green left at all, but look at the lushness and the gentleness that the different plants that were in there were very tender and easily hurt or crushed. As you can see, the mountains were stripped, and it ripped through, I think, Florida as well. But these are the type of domes that they can create for protection or to change certain conditions. You have to know what you're doing, and similar to how we're creating the Dome of Peace, I believe. So we're going to play that.
You haven't,
yes,
Mark, you haven't seen Gianni's latest domes. They're incredible. In a couple of days, he builds these domes from wood, which are all nano-coated.
Yes.
And he's got that specific atmosphere where everything changes inside and around the dome also.
Marvelous work he does, and shares unconditionally. Anyone else before we close? Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for being here. Again, we're all bringing the change. We're all part of it.
Thank you all for allowing me to present. I really appreciate it, and I hope you're enjoying these classes. So look forward to seeing you next week.
So Tom in the Dominican, I think he had a small plot there, and they had put some GANs in different locations. I don't think it was purposely to create a dome, but it was more to feed the plants and the vegetations, although I don't know for sure, but I'm sure his intentions were picked up by the material perhaps and created that dome of protection. I'm sure he put a lot of love and care into the gardening and the plot and so on, and didn't want to see it, but then they left the island, and I think they went back to Florida, and this video is upon his return after Hurricane Maria passed. So we're going to play that. It's about 4.5 minutes or so. And then the
Mark,
disclaimer. Yes.
I'm sorry, I load shedding started and cut everything out. is there any way that you can copy what was in the question Q&A and the chat and somehow send them to me, or I don't know where they can be
I'm
put?
not sure, I'm not sure how to do that, Gail. Again, I'm not very good with these mechanisms.
Probably just copy and then send to Telegram, maybe? in the
If
case.
anyone else can do that for Gail?
No, you can do it, Mark. You're the anfitrion, the manager. You got a folder in your computer or your phone or whatever. It says Zoom archives, and that goes all in there.
Yeah, okay, all right, yeah, maybe I think I know what you're talking, after I render it, you're saying, there's a folder
Yep,
with the chat.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
it does that
forwarded to Gail.
automatically.
Okay, thank you, John, that's very good, appreciate that. Okay, Gail, we can do that.
I think that Randy may have helped me.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long
And-
when you know how to play.
Yeah, and I think Dean also.
Great,
Thank you, guys.
Perfect,
I
thank you.
appreciate that.
We're all working together, supporting each other, giving to
And
each
they did
other.
it so quickly.
Yes, amazing. Almost like they thought it and it happened.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
sure they did a number of clicks, but thank you.
Mm,
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring this video up and then I'm going to take the screen. Thank you all again for joining.